The dust had barely settled on the main road when the silhouette of a man on horseback appeared at the ridge overlooking Caldwell Creek, and every soul in that small Kansas town who happened to glance up from their afternoon business felt a chill run clean through them, because there was only one man in the territory who sat a horse quite like that, wide-shouldered, unhurried, like the mountain itself had decided to take a slow ride down into the valley. It was the autumn of 1878, and Caldwell Creek sat in the southern stretch of Kansas like a stubborn seed that had refused to blow away with all the other hopeful little settlements that had tried and failed along the Kishom Trail corridor. The town had a general store, a livery stable, a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Potts, a barbershop that doubled as a dentist's office on Fridays, a saloon that smelled permanently of sawdust and regret, and a schoolhouse at the eastern edge of town where, on any given weekday morning, you could hear a woman's voice carrying clear and firm through the open windows. That voice belonged to Mabel Underwood. She was 26 years old, with dark chestnut hair, she pinned up so severely that it made the back of her neck look swan-long and proud, and brown eyes that saw everything with an unsettling clarity that made lesser men uncomfortable. She had come to Caldwell Creek at 19 to take the schoolteacher's position when old Mr. Hicks had finally admitted his eyesight had gone too far to read the McGuffey readers to the children anymore. She had planned to stay 1 year. She had stayed 7. The town had slowly, quietly wrapped itself around her like it had been designed for exactly that purpose, and she had let it, because there was no place she had ever felt more like herself than standing in front of that chalkboard with a piece of chalk in her hand, and a room full of children watching her like she held all the answers to everything. But there was a thing in Mabel Underwood's past, or rather, a person that she had stopped talking about so thoroughly and so deliberately that most of the newer residents of Caldwell Creek did not know he had ever existed at all. The older ones, the ones who had been here when it happened, they knew. They knew the shape of the story even if they kept it quiet out of respect for her, because Mabel Underwood had made it abundantly clear through posture and expression, and the set of her jaw that the subject of Isaiah Fairchild was not one she cared to revisit. Isaiah Fairchild had left Caldwell Creek 4 years ago in the cold, iron-gray November of 1874. He had not said goodbye to a single person, and that included Mabel. She had been 22 then. He had been 28. They had known each other for 3 years, had spent those 3 years in a state of such powerful, unspoken understanding that the whole town had simply assumed they would marry. He had been the best tracker and hunting guide in the county, a man who knew the Flint Hills and the land beyond them the way other men knew the backs of their own hands. He had also been a man carrying a grief so large and so unprocessed that it had eventually swallowed him entirely, and one morning Mabel had gone to the small house at the edge of town where he lived, and it had been empty. Not the emptiness of a man who had stepped out for the afternoon. The deep, furniture gone, fire cold, everything taken emptiness of a man who had decided he was no longer a person who lived in that house, or perhaps in that life. She had stood on his porch for a long time. Then she had walked back to the schoolhouse, taught her morning classes, walked home in the afternoon, sat down on her bed in her boarding room at Mrs. Potts's establishment, and cried so hard and so silently that she had given herself a headache that lasted 3 days. After that, she had decided that the subject was closed. And it had been. For 4 years it had been completely, resolutely, permanently closed. Until the afternoon in October of 1878 when Reuben Watts, who ran the livery stable and had the loudest voice in the county, came thundering down the main street on his bad knee, with considerably more speed than his bad knee usually permitted, calling out to anyone who would listen that Isaiah Fairchild was back, that he had just ridden into the stable big as life and bigger than memory, and was asking about the town like a man who had every right to ask. Mabel heard about it from Clara Jessup, who taught Sunday school and had the specific gift of transmitting information at a pace that made the telegraph look leisurely. Clara appeared at the schoolhouse door at 3:30 in the afternoon, while Mabel was erasing the day's arithmetic lesson from the board, and she said, without preamble, "Isaiah Fairchild has come back." Mabel did not turn around. She finished erasing the last of the numbers, set the eraser down on the ledge with a click that was a fraction more forceful than it needed to be, and then she folded her hands in front of her and turned to face Clara Jessup with an expression that she had spent 4 years perfecting, an expression of such composed, measured calm that it gave nothing away whatsoever. "Is that so?" she said. Clara, who had been expecting something more dramatic, looked slightly deflated. "He rode in not 20 minutes ago. Reuben says he looks like he has been living rough for a good long while, but he is well. He asked after you." That last piece of information landed somewhere in the center of Mabel's chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending rings out that she worked very hard to keep from showing on her face. "He asked after me specifically." "By name," Clara confirmed, with the particular satisfaction of a woman delivering information she knew to be loaded. "I see," Mabel said. "Thank you for letting me know, Clara." It was a dismissal, and Clara Jessup recognized it, and to her credit she accepted it with grace, backing out of the schoolhouse door with only a minimal amount of lingering. Mabel waited until the sound of Clara's footsteps had faded completely, and then she sat down in the nearest child's chair, which was about a foot too small for her, and pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed. He had asked after her by name. She thought about what she wanted to feel about that, and then she thought about what she actually felt about it, and she recognized, with the kind of honest reckoning she had always been prone to, that the two things were not quite the same. What she wanted to feel was nothing, or perhaps a mild, detached interest, the kind you might apply to hearing that a stranger had passed through town on their way to somewhere else. What she actually felt was considerably more complicated. She stood up. She straightened her skirt. She walked to the window and looked out at the main street of Caldwell Creek in the late afternoon light, which was the color of old gold and long shadows at this time of year. And she told herself very firmly that she was a sensible woman of 26 who had built a good and purposeful life, and that the return of a man who had disappeared without a word 4 years ago was not something she needed to assign any significance to whatsoever. Then she thought about his voice, which was low and unhurried and particular, and she pressed her fingertips against the cool glass of the window and thought, well. Isaiah Fairchild had not planned to ride into Caldwell Creek that afternoon with anything resembling a plan. The truth of the matter was that he had been riding for 3 days with no destination firmer in his mind than south, and the closer he had gotten to the familiar territory of the Flint Hills, the more south had begun to mean something specific. He had argued with himself about it for the better part of 2 days. He had told himself he had no business going back. He had reminded himself of every good reason he had had for leaving in the first place, and he had reminded himself with equal thoroughness of the way he had left, which was without a word to anyone and in the middle of the night, and with the cowardice of a man who could not face the thing he was walking away from if he looked it directly in the eye. That thing had a name, and the name was Mabel Underwood. He was 32 now. He had spent 4 years in the mountains west and north of here, trapping and hunting and living the kind of solitary life that was either the making or the destroying of a man, depending on the man. He had thought, when he left, that solitude was what he needed. That the grief he carried for his younger brother Thomas, who had been killed by a band of outlaws passing through the county in the spring of 1874, was something he could only process alone, somewhere far from the life they had shared and the reminders of it. Thomas had been 20 years old and had loved horses and bad jokes, and had been learning to read from Mabel Underwood's evening adult literacy classes, which she ran twice a week for free for anyone in the county who wanted them, because that was the kind of woman she was. Isaiah had watched his brother die and had not been able to stop it, and that was the other thing he had been carrying, not just grief but guilt, the specific, corrosive guilt of a man who believes, whether rightly or wrongly, that he should have been able to prevent a loss that was in all honest accounting not preventable. He had run from Caldwell Creek because he had needed to run from something, and because the alternative was sitting still inside his grief, while Mabel Underwood looked at him with those steady, seeing eyes of hers and understood things he had not yet found words for, and that had terrified him more than the mountains ever had. 4 years of solitude had done what solitude does when you let it do its work properly. It had stripped him down to the essential things. It had given him time to carry the grief until it changed shape, which grief will do if you give it enough time and space. It does not go away. It simply becomes something you can carry without it breaking your back. He had thought about Thomas every day for 4 years. He had thought about Mabel for what felt like every moment of every day that he was not actively thinking about Thomas, which meant that, in practical terms, he had thought about her constantly. He had thought about the way she had looked at him the last time he had seen her, which was 3 days before he left, when they had been sitting on the front steps of his house in the early evening, and she had put her hand over his for just a moment without saying anything, and he had understood that she was telling him she knew he was struggling, that she was there, that there was no urgency, that she would wait. He had taken that patience and that kindness, and he had run from it anyway. He was ashamed of that. He had been ashamed of it for 4 years, and the shame had eventually become its own kind of compass, pointing him back the direction he had come from. He had known, somewhere during the 3rd or 4th month alone in the mountains, that if he ever managed to find his footing again, if he ever got to the other side of this grief, he was going to go back. Not because he had any right to, not because she would want him to, but because there were very few things in his life that he had known with complete and uncomplicated certainty, and one of them was that Mabel Underwood was the most extraordinary person he had ever encountered, and leaving her had been the greatest act of foolishness he had ever committed, and a man ought to at least face up to his foolishness directly and say so. So here he was. He had handed his horse to Reuben Watts, who had stared at him with an expression cycling through so many emotions that it was almost comical: surprise, recognition, judgment, reluctant welcome, and had taken the horse without a word and then found words again in the form of questions that Isaiah had answered as simply as he could. Yes, he had been north. Yes, for 4 years. Yes, he was well. No, he did not know what his plans were yet. And then, because he could not help himself, because it was the thing his mouth formed before his better judgment could intervene. Is Mabel Underwood still in town? Reuben had given him a long, complicated look and said, "She is. Still teaching. She is doing well." There had been something in the way Reuben said it, an emphasis on the word well, a slight narrowing of the eyes that Isaiah understood perfectly. She is doing well without you. She managed. Good, Isaiah had said, and he had meant it fully, even as something in his chest tightened around it. He got a room at Mrs. Potts's boarding house, which involved Mrs. Potts herself opening the door, staring at him for a full 5 seconds, and then stepping back to let him in without a word, which from Mrs. Potts was practically a warm embrace. He cleaned himself up as best he could, which was to say he washed off 4 days of trail dust and put on the cleaner of his 2 shirts, and then he sat on the edge of the narrow boarding-house bed and thought very carefully about what he was going to do next. He was not going to seek Mabel out. That much was clear to him. He had forfeited the right to seek her out, and showing up on her doorstep uninvited would be the kind of presumption that deserved exactly the cold reception it would get. What he needed to do was be in the town, let her know through the natural channels of small-town information transmission that he was here, that he was not passing through for some neutral reason but had come back deliberately, and then wait to see what she did with that. It was not much of a plan, but it was what honesty required. The next morning, he walked to the general store to resupply. The general store was run by a man named Herbert Greer, who had one of those faces that seemed to have been specifically designed to look skeptical, and whose skepticism was currently aimed at Isaiah Fairchild with the precision of a rifle sight. "Morning," Isaiah said. "Morning," Herbert said, in the tone of a man reserving judgment. Isaiah gathered what he needed: salt, coffee, flour, a new pair of socks because his had given up the ghost somewhere in Colorado, and set it on the counter and paid for it. He was aware of the other two customers in the store watching him. He was aware of the way conversation had not exactly stopped, but had certainly slowed to a crawl the moment he walked in. He had expected this. Caldwell Creek was a town of perhaps 300 people, and 300 people in a small town formed the kind of tightly woven social fabric that remembered every thread that had ever been pulled loose. He had pulled a significant thread. He was on his way out when the door opened, and he came face to face, for the first time in 4 years, with Mabel Underwood. She was wearing a dark green dress and carrying a basket, and her hair was up the way she always wore it, and she looked exactly the way she had always looked, except for the slight widening of her eyes in the first instant before her expression locked down into something composed and unreadable. She was clearly not expecting him here, not this soon, not this way, and for just a fraction of a second he saw the shock of his presence move across her face before she contained it. He stopped. She stopped. The whole store held its breath. "Mabel," he said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended, rougher with something he did not have a name for yet. "Isaiah," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. It was so perfectly even that it had to be costing her something. "I just got in yesterday," he said, which she knew because this was Caldwell Creek and everyone knew everything by breakfast. I am going to be in town for a while. I hoped if you were willing that I might speak with you, properly, when you have time." She looked at him for a long moment with those brown eyes that saw everything, and he understood that he was being assessed with a thoroughness that was entirely justified. He held her gaze and did not look away, because the least he could do was be looked at honestly. "I have a class this morning," she said finally, "and duties after. I take my evening walk on the path behind the schoolhouse at 6:30, weather permitting." It was not an invitation. It was not an invitation either. It was the most precisely calibrated non-commitment he had ever encountered, and it was so entirely like her that something in the back of his throat ached with it. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, stepped past him with a careful inch of distance between them, and moved to the counter where Herbert Greer was watching with the poorly concealed fascination of a man who has just been gifted the best piece of gossip he would hear all year. Isaiah walked out into the October morning and stood on the boardwalk for a moment in the thin autumn sunlight, and he thought, well, he had a direction. That was more than he had had yesterday. Mabel bought her flour and her salt and her thread, and conducted the entire transaction with Herbert Greer, while fully aware that Herbert was aching to say something, anything, about what had just happened. She forestalled him by talking about the weather, the price of cotton fabric, and the possibility of the first frost arriving early this year, maintaining a level of conversational momentum that left no opening for the topic she was not going to discuss. She walked out of the store with her basket and walked back to the schoolhouse and stood in front of her class of 14 children between the ages of 7 and 13 and taught them about fractions. Fractions. The beauty of fractions. The way a thing could be broken into parts and still add up to a whole. She focused on this with a concentration that had very little to do with arithmetic. He had looked good. That was the infuriating and irrelevant truth of the matter. He had looked rougher and harder and more weathered than she remembered, the mountain years sitting on him like a patina, but the essential thing of him, the steadiness, the particular gravity of his presence was unchanged. He was still the man who could walk into a room and somehow make the room seem more settled, and she hated that she still felt that, hated the way her chest had done something involuntary the moment his eyes found hers. She had told herself for 4 years that she was over it, and she had believed herself mostly. She had gone about her life with the full conviction of a woman who had closed a door and moved on, who had made something good of her days and found satisfaction in her work and her friendships, and the quiet rhythms of a purposeful existence. And then he had said her name in that voice, and she had understood that the door had not been quite as closed as she had believed. That evening at 6:30, she put on her shawl and walked the path behind the schoolhouse as she had done every fair-weather evening for the last 3 years. The path wound through a stand of cottonwood trees down to the edge of a creek that was smaller than its namesake town, past a large flat rock she had taken to sitting on when the mood struck her, and back around through the prairie grass to the road. It was a 20-minute walk in its entirety, and she had done it so many times she could have done it blind. He was waiting near the cottonwood trees, leaning against one of them in that way he had that made it look like he had grown there, hat in his hands, and when he saw her coming he straightened without any attempt to look casual about it. She walked up to him and stopped at a conversational distance and looked at him and waited, because whatever was going to be said next was going to come from him and she was not going to make it easier by filling the silence. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I owe you an apology, a significant one. I left without a word to you and that was wrong, and I have known it was wrong for 4 years and I am sorry for it." She had not expected him to lead with that. She had expected explanations, justifications, the architecture of reasoning that people build around the things they have done. The bare apology without the scaffolding of self-defense was not what she had braced for, and it took her a moment to recalibrate. "Why did you come back?" she asked. He turned his hat in his hands. "Because I needed to. Because there are things I should have said before I left and things I want to say now, and I am not going to presume that you want to hear them. But I wanted to be honest with you that that is why I am here, not just passing through." "And what things would those be?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "I was drowning when Thomas died. I know that is not an excuse for disappearing on the people who cared about me, but it is the truth of it. I did not have the capacity to stay and be the kind of person I wanted to be for you, and I was afraid that if I stayed and fell apart in front of you, you would try to hold me together, and the weight of that not you, but the idea of letting you see how completely I was broken, it was more than I could face." Mabel was quiet for a moment. The cottonwood leaves moved above them with a dry, papery sound in the evening breeze. "Thomas was learning to read," she said finally. "In my evening classes. I think about that sometimes, how proud he was getting better at it." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "He talked about those classes constantly. He thought you were the most capable person he had ever met." "He was a good student," she said, and then, before she could talk herself out of the honesty, "I grieved him too, Isaiah. He was part of this town and part of my life, and I wanted to grieve him with you and you did not give me the chance." The words landed between them with a quiet weight. He nodded, receiving them, not deflecting. "I know that now," he said. "I did not know it then. Or I knew it and I ran from it anyway, which is worse." She looked at him for a long time. The light was going soft and amber around them, the sun dropping toward the flat western horizon, and she thought about how many evenings she had walked this path alone, and how strange it was to have him standing in it now, occupying the space like he had always been part of the landscape. "I am not in a position to simply resume where we were," she said. "You need to understand that. I do understand that. But I am also not going to refuse to speak to you because I am not a person who holds grudges as a principle, and because you have explained yourself honestly, which I respect." She paused. "You may walk with me in the evenings if you want. We can talk. But I will not make you any promises and I will not have any made to me." He nodded. "Those are fair terms." She began walking, and after a moment he fell into step beside her, at a careful distance, and they walked along the creek path through the fading light in a silence that was not entirely comfortable but that was, at least, honest. Over the following days, the town watched with the collective fascination that small towns bring to bear on the romantic complications of their residents. Isaiah went about the business of being back in Caldwell Creek with a quiet deliberateness. He visited the sheriff's office and reintroduced himself to the current sheriff, a solid man named Carter Webb, who had moved to Caldwell Creek 2 years after Isaiah left and therefore had no prior relationship with him to navigate. He helped Reuben Watts with a fence repair at the livery stable. He had coffee at the saloon, which in the mornings served as a perfectly respectable breakfast establishment, with the older men of the town who had known him before, accepting their various receptions, some warm, some reserved, some openly reproachful, without complaint. He was aware that his reception in this town was contingent in large part on how Mabel Underwood behaved toward him, because she was one of the most respected people in Caldwell Creek, and the town took its cue from her in matters of character assessment. And she, for her part, behaved toward him with a precise and scrupulous civility that gave the watchers very little to work with. They took their evening walks. Every fair-weather evening he was at the cottonwood trees, hat in hand, and she would join him, and they would walk the creek path while the prairie darkened around them, and the coyotes began their evening conversations in the distance. He told her about the mountains, about the first winter, which had been brutal and had nearly killed him, not from cold or starvation, but from the particular kind of despair that settles in when a man cuts himself off from everything that connects him to the world. About how he had found his footing slowly, the way spring comes to high country, reluctantly, then all at once. About the things he had learned in 4 years of living close to the land, skills he had always had but which solitude had deepened and refined. About the way grief worked when you gave it room, how it changed texture and temperature over time. She told him about the school, about the children who had come and gone, about the new families who had settled near Caldwell Creek in the last 4 years, about the year the well had run dry in September, and everyone had been on edge until the October rains came. She told him about the small triumphs and frustrations of a life spent in education, the child who had learned to read at 8 and wept with joy when he finally cracked through the difficulty, the girl who had wanted to do sums but whose father had pulled her from school at 12 to help with the homestead. "Do you still run the evening classes?" he asked one evening, about a week after his return. They were sitting on the flat rock by the creek which they had arrived at naturally, neither of them having suggested it, simply walking at the pace the evening invited until they reached the place where sitting seemed right. "I do," she said, "Tuesday and Thursday evenings. The attendance varies. Sometimes it is 3 people, sometimes it is 8 or 10. Thomas would have," he started and then stopped. "He would have loved it," she said quietly, filling in the space he had left. He had gotten quite good by the end. He was reading whole passages from the Bible on his own. He was very proud of himself. Isaiah was quiet for a moment. A great horned owl called from somewhere in the cottonwoods. "I have not talked about him much," he said. "In 4 years, not to anyone." "You can talk about him to me," she said. The simplicity of it, the plain, unhesitating offer moved through him like something warm and slow. He looked at her in the dim light. This woman who had been so patient with him, who had been patient with him 4 years ago, and was being patient with him again, now even though she had every reason not to be. And he thought that there was no word in the English language adequate to describe how much he had missed her. "He was a pest," he said, and his voice had something in it that was both grief and laughter at once. "All his life. The kind of younger brother who followed you everywhere and repeated everything you said and somehow never became annoying about it, just became part of the scenery. I used to take him tracking when he was small. He was terrible at being quiet. He would step on every dry branch in the territory." Mabel smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that changed her whole face. "He told me once that you were the reason he wanted to learn to read. He said you used to read to him from the almanac when he was small because it was the only book in the house, and he decided he wanted to be able to read things like that for himself one day." Isaiah pressed the heel of his hand against the corner of his eye for a moment. Then he said steadily, "I did not know that." "You should know it," she said. "He loved you very much." They sat on the flat rock while the stars came out, one by one, and the creek made its steady small sound beside them, and they talked about Thomas for a long time, and it was the most painful and the most relieving conversation Isaiah Fairchild had had in 4 years. Walking back to the boarding house that night, he made a decision. He was going to stay. He was going to stay, and he was going to do the work of proving, through consistency and time and every honest action he could manage, that he was capable of being the person he should have been 4 years ago. He did not know if Mabel would ever look at him the way she once had. He had no right to expect it. But he knew that he was not going anywhere, and that whatever came of it would come honestly, in its own time, without pressure or expectation. He talked to Carter Webb the next morning about the possibility of work. Carter was a careful man who did not make decisions quickly, but he was also a practical one. And the truth was that Caldwell Creek and the surrounding county had been dealing for the past several months with an increasingly troublesome situation involving a band of horse thieves who had been working the ranches in the area. And Carter's small force of 2 deputies was not enough to track them across the kind of terrain they were operating in. "I hear you were the best tracker in this county before you went north," Carter said. "I know this land," Isaiah said simply. "You would not be deputized. I cannot offer that. You have been gone too long and I do not know you well enough yet. But I can offer wages as a scout, tracking the horses, helping my deputies work the trails." "That suits me," Isaiah said. He spent the next 3 weeks in the hills with Carter's 2 deputies, a young man named Pete Hollies who was 22 and so eager he practically vibrated, and an older man named Sam Grady who had the patience of stone and the observational skills to match. Together, with Isaiah reading the land the way he had always been able to read it, the broken grass, the particular angle of a hoofprint in the clay, the way the birds moved in the tree line, they traced the horse thieves to a dry camp in the ravines east of town, and Carter Webb rode out with a warrant and the 3 of them, and recovered 11 stolen horses, and brought in 4 men who were passed along to the district court in Wichita. When they rode back into Caldwell Creek with the recovered horses, the ranchers who had been robbed met them on the main street with the kind of gratitude that expressed itself in vigorous handshaking and several bottles of good whiskey distributed among the recovery party. And Sheriff Carter Webb stood on the boardwalk and told the assembled residents of Caldwell Creek that Isaiah Fairchild's knowledge of the territory had made the whole operation possible. Mabel was not on the main street when they rode in, but she had heard about it from Clara Jessup by the time Isaiah knocked on the door of Mrs. Potts's boarding house that evening, where Mabel was having dinner, as she did on the first and third Thursday of each month as a standing arrangement with Mrs. Potts, who was a fine cook and appreciated the company. "You could have told me you were going out with the sheriff's party," Mabel said when Mrs. Potts had discreetly removed herself to the kitchen. "I did not want to make more of it than it was," he said. He had cleaned up and his hat was in his hands and he looked faintly embarrassed by the attention, which was another thing about him she had always found infuriating and endearing in equal measure. "It was tracking work. That is something I know how to do." "You were gone for 3 weeks," she said. "Is that a complaint?" he asked, and then looked immediately as though he wished he had not said it quite that way because it carried an implication of something being expected. But Mabel looked at him for a moment and said honestly, "I found that I noticed the absence." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it, the kind that means something more is in it than the words have said. "I thought about coming back sooner," she said. "To speaking to you, I mean. In the first year after you left, I thought about it and then I decided not to." "Why not?" "Because I was angry," she said. "And I did not think anger was a useful state in which to attempt a sensible conversation." "That is a very reasonable decision," he said. "I thought so. And then the year became 2 years and 2 became 3, and I had got on well enough that it seemed like there was no longer a conversation to have." "And now?" he asked. She looked at him with those clear, steady eyes. "And now I am not sure what I think. I know that I have been looking forward to the evenings, which is information I am giving you plainly because I think you deserve plain information." He set his hat on the table and sat down across from her and folded his hands and said, "I need to tell you something, and I would like to say it clearly so there is no misunderstanding." She waited. "I came back to Caldwell Creek because of you," he said. "I came back because of what I left unfinished and unsaid and undone, and because in 4 years of examining every decision I have ever made, leaving you the way I did was the one I came back to most consistently as having been wrong. Not just regrettable, wrong." He held her gaze. "I am not saying that to create pressure or expectation. I do not need anything from you in return. But you have been honest with me since I returned, and I owe you the same honesty. And the honest truth is that you are the reason I came back to this town specifically, and not to any other place in the territory." Mabel was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind was picking up slightly, rattling the window in its frame in the comfortable, familiar way of a building that has settled into its bones. "I appreciate your saying so," she said finally, "and I will tell you something in return. I have been more at ease this past month than I have been in longer than I want to admit. And that is partly because of the evenings, and partly because having you back in this town makes it feel more like itself in a way I cannot entirely account for." He looked at her and something crossed his face that was too complicated and too full to name, and she thought, watching it, that she had missed him in exactly the same way one misses a particular quality of light, not a specific event or a specific day, but a tone that runs beneath everything, an essential thing that is simply absent when it is absent. "Would you let me court you properly?" he asked. "I understand if the answer is no, or not yet, but I want to ask it plainly." She thought about it. She did not answer immediately, which was her nature and which she knew he remembered was her nature, because he waited without fidgeting or filling the space with additional words. "Yes," she said, "you may court me properly, but I will tell you now that I will not be easy about it." "I would not want you to be," he said, and the way he said it was so entirely sincere and so completely devoid of anything performative that it settled something in her chest that had been unsettled for 4 years. The courtship of Mabel Underwood by Isaiah Fairchild was conducted in full view of Caldwell Creek, which had opinions about it that it shared freely with both parties. Clara Jessup thought it was romantic. Herbert Greer at the general store thought Isaiah had some nerve and said so to anyone who would listen, though he softened somewhat as the weeks went on. Mrs. Potts, who watched things more carefully than she spoke about them, said nothing publicly but took to setting out an extra cup at the table on Thursdays when she knew Isaiah would be about. He brought her things. Not extravagant things. There was no possibility of extravagance on a scout's wages, but considered things. A book he found at the general store, a natural history that she had mentioned in passing being interested in. A particularly fine piece of obsidian he had found in the creek bed when tracking one afternoon, smooth and black and perfect, which she knew he had picked up because she had once, years ago, mentioned that she collected interesting rocks and kept them on her windowsill. She added the obsidian to the collection and noted the weight of the meaning in it, the fact of his having remembered something small from a conversation years past. He showed up at her evening classes on a Tuesday in November and sat in the back row without explanation. And when one of her adult students, an older man named Virgil who had never had any formal schooling, and was working through his letters with the particular determination of someone making up for lost time, got stuck on a difficult passage, Isaiah leaned over and said something quiet to Virgil that made the older man laugh and try again with more confidence. Afterward, when the students had gone, Isaiah helped Mabel stack the chairs, and she looked at him across the dusty lamplight of the schoolhouse and thought that there was no one she had ever known who made usefulness look so natural, as though helping were simply the obvious response to the presence of something that needed doing. "You were good with Virgil," she said. "He reminds me of Thomas," Isaiah said simply. "The way he wants to get it right." She set down the last chair and stood looking at him. "Do you want to be a part of this, the classes?" He considered the question with the seriousness she gave it. "I think I would like that," he said, "if you will have me. I could help on Tuesday evenings. I am not a teacher, but I can sit with someone and work through it." "You can," she agreed. And that was how Isaiah Fairchild became an unofficial assistant to Mabel Underwood's Tuesday evening adult literacy class, which expanded in attendance over the following month as word got around that there was now someone in the class who could help individually with the more practical physical reading tasks, trail markers, almanac entries, livestock records, the things that the men of the community needed to read most urgently. She watched him with those students, and she felt something she had been very carefully guarding against feel begin to give way. Not all at once. It was not that kind of thing. It was more the way river ice goes in early spring, a crack here, a crack there, the slow shift of something solid becoming something moving. They had their first real argument in the middle of November. It was over something and nothing, the way first real arguments between people who know each other tend to be. He had taken a 3-day scouting assignment from Carter Webb without mentioning it to her beforehand, and she had heard about it from Pete Holly's at the general store, and she had walked back to the schoolhouse with her jaw set, and her eyes bright with the particular energy of someone exercising maximum restraint. That evening she said to him carefully, "I am not asking you to account for your time to me. I have no claim on your time and I would not presume to have one. But I am asking you, as a courtesy, to inform me when you are going to be away from town for several days, because I find that I prefer to know." He had been about to defend himself by pointing out that he had not thought it a significant trip and had not wanted to make much of it, and he stopped himself in the middle of the breath before the words came, and thought about what she was actually saying, which was not that he needed her permission but that she cared enough about his whereabouts to want to know them, and that the caring of someone like Mabel Underwood was not something to be efficient about. "You are right," he said. "I should have told you. I will in the future." She had been prepared for him to defend himself and had her responses ready, and his simple agreement disarmed her so completely that she stood there for a moment looking at him with something that was almost amusement and almost exasperation. "You are going to make this very difficult for me," she said. "What specifically?" "Staying annoyed at you." He smiled at that, and it was the first time she had seen him fully smile since he had come back, and she discovered that it still did the thing it had always done, which was to make the room feel several degrees warmer and generally better than it had been a moment before. December came with a cold snap that turned the creek path to iron and drove the cottonwood leaves from the trees, and made the prairie look spare and ancient under the low gray sky. They moved their evening walks inside, to the schoolhouse after the students had gone, sitting by the iron stove with coffee from the small pot she kept in the storage room, talking the way they had always been able to talk, without agenda, without performance, the way two people talk when they have gotten comfortable enough with each other to simply say what they think. He told her about a night in his second year in the mountains when a blizzard had come on so fast and so hard that he had barely had time to make his small shelter, and how he had lain inside it listening to the wind with the particular clear knowledge that he was entirely alone in the world and had made himself so, and how he had thought about this town, and about her with an ache so complete it had felt physical. She told him about the October of his third year away, when she had found herself crying on her birthday for no reason she could identify clearly, which she had attributed at the time to general fatigue, and had later suspected was grief of its own particular variety. They talked about Thomas often, and each conversation about him felt like a small, necessary loosening, the way a knot works free when you handle it patiently instead of forcing it. It was 2 days before Christmas when he kissed her. They had been standing on the front steps of the schoolhouse after a particularly well-attended Tuesday class, and the night was cold and very clear, the stars so bright over the dark flat land that they looked almost close enough to be a source of warmth rather than just light. She had been laughing at something, a story he had told about Virgil, who had just successfully read his first complete page of a livestock ledger, and had been so pleased with himself that he had immediately gone home and read the whole ledger to his wife, who had then shown up at the class the following week herself. And the laugh was full and unguarded, the kind she did not produce often. And he had been watching her produce it with a feeling in his chest so complete and so certain that it had simply overridden all his careful intentions about timing and restraint. He had taken half a step toward her and she had looked up, still half laughing, and seen his expression, and the laugh had softened into something else, and she had not stepped back, and so he had closed the remaining distance and kissed her. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was quiet and careful and warm, the kind of kiss that is a question and an apology and a statement of intent all at once, and she kissed him back in a way that was none of those things and all of them simultaneously. When they separated, she looked at him with her eyes very bright in the starlight and said, "I have been waiting for that for an unreasonably long time." "The unreasonable part was my fault," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It was." He laughed and she laughed, and the cold air took their laughter up and sent it out across the dark street of Caldwell Creek, and from the saloon across the way old Jim Pratchett, who was 71 and had seen everything in this territory, lifted his glass to the window because he had been watching the schoolhouse steps from his usual seat, and he thought that there were some things in this world that simply needed to happen eventually, and it was a satisfaction to see them happen. Christmas in Caldwell Creek was a community affair. The church held a service. Mrs. Potts made pies. The children from Mabel's school performed a small pageant that she had been rehearsing with them since November, and the whole town gathered in the church hall afterward for cider and food, and the warmth of collective existence in the cold of the year. Isaiah sat beside Mabel during the pageant and watched the children perform with the kind of concentrated attention he normally reserved for reading a trail, as though the small drama unfolding in front of him was the most important thing happening in the world. She noticed this and thought about it and understood that it was not performance. He was genuinely, completely present in the moment, which was something rare in a person and something she had forgotten she had always valued about him. He met her parents for the first time since his return at the Christmas gathering. Her father, William Underwood, had traveled from Wichita for the holiday, a solid, methodical man who had retired from farming to keeping accounts, and who looked at Isaiah with the considered assessment of a man trying to determine the structural integrity of something he was thinking of relying on. Her mother, Grace Underwood, was smaller and quicker and had Mabel's eyes, and she greeted Isaiah with a warmth that made Mabel privately suspect her mother had made up her mind about him some time before this specific meeting. William Underwood took Isaiah aside at one point during the evening and had a conversation that Mabel was not present for and did not ask about afterward, which was her way of indicating that she trusted both of them to handle it with respect. Isaiah told William directly that he had made a serious mistake 4 years ago, that he was back because of Mabel specifically, and that his intentions were serious ones. William was quiet for a moment and then said that his daughter had good judgment and he trusted it, but that trust was a thing built over time and not awarded in advance, and that he would be watching. Isaiah said that was fair and meant it. January brought more cold and also brought a complication. A man named Vernon Holt arrived in Caldwell Creek. Vernon Holt was 30 years old, well-dressed in the manner of a man who has money and wants this to be known, and he arrived with the stated purpose of looking into the possibility of buying land in the area for cattle ranching. He took a room at Mrs. Potts's and was perfectly pleasant to everyone he encountered, and within a week of his arrival he had discovered that Mabel Underwood was the school teacher and had begun making a point of being wherever she happened to be. This was not inherently sinister. Vernon Holt was a perfectly personable man. But he was also clearly interested in Mabel in a way that was more than incidental, and he had the social fluency to make that interest known, while maintaining the appearance of perfectly innocent friendliness. And Mabel, who was aware of what he was doing, responded with the precise, controlled civility she brought to all situations she was not entirely comfortable with. Isaiah was aware of Vernon Holt within approximately 1 day of his arrival, because small towns, and because Pete Hollis, who kept Isaiah updated on the general intelligence of Caldwell Creek, with the enthusiasm of a man who found information valuable primarily as something to share. Isaiah had one conversation with himself about Vernon Holt, which consisted of him saying to himself, inside his own mind, that he had no right to be possessive of Mabel's time or attention, that he had been the one to leave, and she had owed him nothing in his absence and owed him nothing now, and that the correct response to Vernon Holt's presence was to be the kind of man he wanted to be and let the rest unfold as it would. He did not like Vernon Holt, but he handled it the way he handled most things, by being quiet about it and consistent about everything else. Mabel, for her part, handled the situation by being direct. One evening in mid-January, when Vernon Holt appeared at the schoolhouse on the pretext of asking about the possibility of his nephew potentially attending her school, a nephew who lived in Missouri and was therefore a somewhat theoretical prospect, she had waded through the full explanation and then said pleasantly, "Mr. Holt, I think you are a sociable man, and I have no objection to your sociability. But I am being courted by someone, and I would not want there to be any confusion about that." Vernon Holt had taken this with reasonable grace, being the kind of man who preferred clarity in social arrangements to ambiguity. He had tipped his hat, said that the lucky fellow in question should know what he had, and excused himself. He stayed in town for another 2 weeks for his original stated purpose of land assessment, was perfectly pleasant throughout, and then departed, and that was the end of the Vernon Holt complication. When Mabel told Isaiah about it, she told him that same evening, because it seemed like the kind of thing he should hear from her and not from Pete Hollis. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "You did not have to do that." "I know I did not have to," she said. "I wanted to." He looked at her, and she thought she saw something in his face that was more than gratitude, something that was closer to the specific tenderness of a person who has been given something they were not sure they deserved. "I am going to ask you something," he said, "and I am asking it because I want to, not because anything specific has prompted it." "All right," she said. "Will you marry me?" The February evening was cold and blew outside the schoolhouse windows, and the iron stove ticked warmly beside them, and the schoolhouse smelled of chalk and wood smoke, and Mabel Underwood looked at Isaiah Fairchild for a long, steady moment with the full weight of her considerable intelligence and her hard-won understanding of herself and of him, and she thought about what it meant to love a person clearly, without the softening distortion of either hope or fear. To see them as they actually were and to want them anyway. "Yes," she said, "I will." He reached across the small table they were sitting at and took her hand in both of his, and he looked at her the way the mountains must look at the valley on the first morning of spring, with the kind of patience that has survived a long winter and knows, now, that it was worth surviving for. The engagement was the subject of comment in Caldwell Creek for approximately 3 weeks, after which it was simply a known fact of the town, incorporated into its fabric with the easy naturalness of something that had always been there. Clara Jessup cried with happiness and then apologized for crying, which Mabel told her was unnecessary. Herbert Greer at the general store said something gruff and complimentary that he clearly wished he could take back, but that Mabel thanked him for with sincerity. Carter Webb shook Isaiah's hand and said, "Good man, good woman, good match," which was the longest personal statement Carter Webb had been known to make on any subject. Mrs. Potts at the Thursday dinner said nothing at all, but produced a bottle of elderberry wine she had been keeping since the previous summer and poured it into actual glass glasses, which she normally reserved for high occasions, and said simply, "Congratulations," in the tone of a woman who has been waiting for an event and is satisfied it has arrived. Mabel wrote to her parents. Her mother wrote back within 10 days with a letter so full of happiness that it made Mabel smile all through the reading of it. Her father wrote separately, a shorter letter which said, Isaiah Fairchild made a strong accounting of himself at Christmas. I believe he means what he says. I give my blessing with full sincerity. This was, from William Underwood, the equivalent of a standing ovation. They set the date for the 1st of May, a decision made on practical grounds. As spring would be fully established by then, the mud of March and April resolved into something navigable, and the school year coming toward its close, so Mabel's timing would be manageable. In the weeks between the engagement and the wedding, Caldwell Creek demonstrated its full capacity for community involvement in a domestic event. The women of the town organized, without anyone having officially asked them to, the making of a wedding quilt, which appeared in stages at Mabel's door throughout the month of March, each edition contributed by different hands. The men of the town, not to be outdone in sentiment, went about the business of helping Isaiah and Mabel establish a household, which required a house, which required the old Hennessy place at the edge of town to be cleaned out, repaired, and made habitable, which was accomplished over 3 Saturdays in April with the kind of collaborative, competitive competence that men bring to manual labor when they are trying not to be seen as sentimental. Isaiah and Mabel walked through the Hennessy place on a Sunday afternoon when the repairs were done, moving from room to room in the spring light. It was not a large house, 4 rooms, a kitchen that would need work, a porch that looked west over the prairie, but it was solid and it was theirs, and walking through it with her, watching her look at the spaces and think about what they would become, Isaiah felt something in his chest that was so large and so uncomplicated that he was briefly unable to say anything at all. She stopped in the front room, which had a window looking east toward the schoolhouse, and she said, I can see the school from here. I thought you would want that, he said. She turned and looked at him, and what was in her face was not the composed, guarded thing he had worked so carefully to earn past, but the real, undefended thing, full and clear and entirely hers. I love you, she said. It was the first time she had said it to him. She said it in the plain, declarative tone of someone stating an evident truth, without flourish, because Mabel Underwood had never needed flourish for the important things. He crossed the room in 2 steps and held her face in his hands and said, I love you, and I have loved you since before I knew what to do with it, and I will spend the rest of my life doing better at it than I did at the beginning. She put her hands over his and said, Yes, you will. The wedding took place on the 1st of May, 1879, in the Caldwell Creek church, which was full in a way that left people standing at the back and spilling out the door. The minister was a Reverend Avery from Wichita who had traveled down specifically, a kindly man with a white beard and an appreciation for the particular ceremony of a love story that had taken the long way around. Mabel wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her, a cream-colored affair that was entirely practical by the standards of wedding fashion, but entirely perfect for the woman in it. Isaiah wore a dark coat that he had bought in Wichita specifically for this occasion, and which fit him well enough that Pete Hollis said, under his breath, that it was unfair for a man to be that well put together, which made Sam Grady snort. When Mabel walked down the aisle on her father's arm, Isaiah was standing at the front of the church watching her come toward him with the expression of a man who has been given something he understands the full value of. And the minister later said privately that in 30 years of performing marriages, he had rarely seen a groom look quite that much like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. They said their vows in clear, steady voices, each one looking directly at the other, and there was no hesitation in either of them. After the ceremony, the town held a gathering outside in the warm May afternoon that lasted until the stars came out, with food and music from a fiddler named Cal Birch who could play anything from a reel to a waltz with equal competence. And Isaiah danced with Mabel on the packed earth of the main street with a seriousness of purpose that made her laugh and pull him in closer. And they danced until the music stopped, and then stood still in the middle of the street for a moment, her head against his chest, his arms around her, the whole of Caldwell Creek celebrating around them. "We are married," she said. "We are," he agreed. "I find that I am entirely content with that," she said. "So am I," he said. The life they built at the Hennessy place, which quickly became simply their house, which quickly became simply home, was a good one. Isaiah continued his scouting work for Carter Webb, which remained occasional rather than constant, supplemented by the hunting and tracking work he had always done, guiding some of the cattlemen and ranchers through unfamiliar territory, finding water and reading weather, and doing the things the land required of the people who understood it. He was known, over the following year, as the best tracker in a wide area of southern Kansas, and men came from neighboring counties to hire his skill when they needed it, which provided a respectable income and kept him doing work that suited him without requiring him to be away from Caldwell Creek for longer than he could bear to be. Mabel taught through the school year and ran her evening classes and was, as she had always been, the educational cornerstone of Caldwell Creek, a role that expanded slightly with the arrival of new families in the area throughout 1879 and 1880. She expanded the class, took on a younger assistant teacher in 1880, a girl named Ruth Ann who had attended Mabel's school herself and had the gift for it, and began advocating through letters to the county board for a proper, larger school building. The county board, after 2 years of letters that were increasingly well-reasoned and increasingly difficult to find objection to, approved the funds in 1881. Isaiah helped build it. In the early spring of 1880, Mabel told Isaiah she was expecting a child. She told him on a Sunday morning when they were both still at the kitchen table after breakfast, and she said it in the same plain, declarative tone she used for important truths, and he sat very still for a moment and then got up and went around the table and held her in a way that was careful and complete, as though she were something precious he had been entrusted with, and said nothing for a long time because nothing was necessary. Their son was born in October of 1880. They named him Thomas William Fairchild Thomas for Isaiah's brother, William for Mabel's father, and both names for the simple reason that both men deserved the honoring. Thomas William was a noisy, emphatic, red-faced presence from the first day of his life, and he was clearly going to be a handful, which Mabel had anticipated, and Isaiah found somewhat hilarious given that his own brother had had exactly the same quality. Virgil, the older student from Mabel's literacy class who had read his whole ledger to his wife, was so moved by the announcement of Thomas William's arrival that he brought a carved wooden horse to the house the very next day, which he had made himself over the winter in anticipation, because, as he told Isaiah simply, a man ought to do something useful when good things happen. The wooden horse sat on the mantelpiece for years. Caldwell Creek continued to grow and change in the way of western towns in the late 1870s and 1880s, and not all of the change was comfortable. The railroad was extending its reach through Kansas, and with it came the particular disruption of economic and social patterns that the railroad always brought. Some people made money. Some people found their circumstances altered in ways they had not chosen. Some of the open range that the Kisham Trail had depended on was being fenced and settled. The cattle drives that had been the economic pulse of towns like Caldwell Creek were changing, and the town had to reckon with what it would become as the frontier era it had been founded in began, slowly and unevenly, to close itself. Isaiah and Mabel talked about this often, in the evenings on their porch that faced the western sky. The injustices of the frontier were not abstract to them. Isaiah had seen enough of the plains in his years of traveling them to know that the land itself carried the history of the peoples who had been pushed from it, and the Cheyenne and Kiowa, whose territory this had been lived in the constrained geography of reservation life now, a generation of dispossession and violence that no amount of productive settlement could honestly be called balanced against. These were things that Isaiah spoke about with the directness of a man who had been in the hills and valleys and had seen the evidence of what had been lost with his own eyes, and Mabel, who taught the history she knew to her students as honestly as she could, believed that the truth of the land's past was part of its present whether it was comfortable or not. They were not people who could change the large shape of history. But they were people who tried to be honest about it, and to live with the care and the consciousness of those who know that the ground they stand on has a story longer than their own. In the spring of 1882, their daughter arrived. They named her Clara, partly in genuine affection for Clara Jessup, and partly because Clara Jessup had made it so abundantly clear for 2 years that she was hoping for the honor that declining to name the child after her would have felt actively unkind. Clara Fairchild was a quieter creature than her brother, with her father's stillness and her mother's eyes, and she took to watching everything with an attention that made people uncomfortable until they understood it was assessment, not judgment. Thomas William, at 1.5 years, received his baby sister with an expression of profound skepticism that made Isaiah laugh until he had to sit down. The years layered themselves, one on the other, with the ordinary extraordinary accumulation of a life shared between two people who had found each other through a long way round. Isaiah taught Thomas William to track on the Flat Hills land north of town, the same way he had taught Thomas the younger, the way his own father had taught him, and the boy proved to have the instinct for it, the patience, the stillness, the capacity to read a landscape. Mabel taught both children to read before they were school age, which was not entirely a surprise to anyone, and Clara in particular took to books the way some children take to water, reading everything she could get her hands on with a thoroughness that her mother found simultaneously delightful and faintly alarming. In 1883, the new schoolhouse was finished and opened, larger and better lit than the old one, and the opening ceremony was attended by what seemed like the entirety of southern Kansas, and the county board representative gave a speech in which he mentioned Mabel Underwood Fairchild's years of advocacy for the project by name and credited her as the reason it had happened, which made Herbert Greer at the general store nod, with a vigorous approval that somewhat contradicted his earlier skepticism about her husband, but which no one pointed out to him, because this was a celebratory occasion. Mabel stood in the doorway of the new schoolhouse and looked out at the gathered crowd, and at Isaiah standing with Thomas William on his shoulders at the back of the crowd, because their son had wanted a better view, and at Ruth Ann, who was already inside arranging the new desks with the organizational precision that made her an excellent assistant teacher, and at Virgil, who had come despite his creaking joints, and was beaming with the specific pride of a former student watching a school grow. And she felt the particular fullness of a life that is where it is supposed to be. That evening she told Isaiah about that feeling, and he listened to the whole of it and then said, "When I was on that mountain in the second winter, there was a morning when the weather cleared and I could see for 100 miles. Every ridge, every valley, all the way to the plains. And I thought, there is Caldwell Creek somewhere out there, and there is Mabel Underwood in it, living her life without any help from me, doing what she does, and it is still the most important thing I know about this world." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight, and she thought about that image, Isaiah alone on a mountain in the cold, seeing all the way to where she was, and she thought that love, the real kind, was not the absence of difficulty or the absence of mistakes or the absence of the long and necessary silences that sometimes grow between people. It was the knowing through all of it where you were oriented, the persistent fact of the direction. "You came back," she said simply. "You let me," he said. "I let you because you deserved to come back," she said, "and because this was where you were supposed to be." They sat in comfortable quiet for a while, and the house held them. The house they had made into a home, with the wooden horse on the mantelpiece and the obsidian stone on the windowsill and the smell of coffee and wood smoke and children, and all the accumulated evidence of years of living. And outside the prairie lay vast and dark under the Kansas stars, the same stars that had been over this land long before them and would be over it long after. Indifferent to the small dramas of human hearts, except insofar as those hearts were themselves part of the land, shaped by it, belonging to it. Thomas William, who was 3 by now and had recently discovered that climbing the fence post was within his capabilities, called from the back room in the specific tone of a child who has either hurt himself or is about to. And Isaiah was on his feet and out of the kitchen before Mabel had finished standing, and she could hear him in the back room, his low voice calm and certain, talking their son through whatever small crisis had presented itself. And she stood in the kitchen doorway listening to the sound of her husband and her child, and she thought, this is it. This is the whole of it. There is no more important thing. She went to help. The years kept moving, the way they do in the West, in long sweeps of weather and light, and the slow, accumulating change of a place finding its permanent shape. Caldwell Creek grew and settled. The cattle drives wound down as the decade turned, but the town had enough of its own economy by then, farming, trade, the school, the community, to stay and to matter. Isaiah turned 40 in 1886. Mabel made him a birthday supper with the full collaboration of both children, which meant Thomas William contributed by enthusiastically mixing things at the wrong time, and Clara contributed by reading, aloud the recipe with a precise, corrective energy that was so entirely like her mother that Isaiah had to press his mouth together to keep from laughing. At the table that night, with the lamplight over all of them and the prairie wind outside and the supper on the table and his family before him, Isaiah thought about the man he had been on the mountain, alone in the cold, looking south. He thought about the morning he had finally turned his horse toward Caldwell Creek with no plan and no certainty, and only the compass of what he knew was right. He thought about Mabel on the steps of the general store with her basket, the shock of him moving across her face before she contained it, the evenings on the creek path, the flat rock, the first full conversation about Thomas, the look she had given him across the schoolhouse when he had told her he was staying, the look that had said, I know you, and I am not making you any promises, and I am here. Thomas William asked him what he was thinking, because Thomas William was 6 and asked everyone what they were thinking at approximately all times. I am thinking, Isaiah said, that this is the best supper I have ever had in my life. Thomas William accepted this with the satisfaction of a person whose contribution has been adequately valued, and went back to his food with renewed purpose. Mabel looked at Isaiah across the table and she smiled, the full, unguarded one, the one that changed her whole face, and he smiled back, and there was everything in the exchange that needed to be there: the years, the distance, the coming back, the staying, the choice made and kept and remade every morning of a life in common. Clara, at 4, had the observational habit of noticing things adults were not paying attention to. She noticed the look her parents gave each other across the table, and she filed it away with the precise attention she gave to everything. And years later, when she was grown and someone asked her what she remembered about her parents, she would say, I remember how they looked at each other across the table on ordinary evenings, like they were seeing something that never got old. The night after the birthday supper, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Mabel and Isaiah sat on the porch in the cool September dark and listened to the coyotes calling in the distance and the wind in the grass. And he put his arm around her and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and neither of them needed to say anything because they were past the point where the important things required words, though he said one thing after a while. I am glad I came back, he said. She tilted her head and looked up at him. I know, she said. Are you glad? He said. Not with any uncertainty, just the way a person asks a question they know the answer to but want the pleasure of hearing anyway. Every single day, she said, and that was the truth of it. Every single day, from the day she had let him walk beside her on the creek path to this night on the porch with 2 children sleeping inside, and a 3rd year of the decade ending, and the prairie spreading out vast and full and indifferent and beautiful around them. Every single day she was glad. The mountain man had come down from the mountain. He had come back to the town, and to the woman who had never been quite out of his mind for a single day in the years he was gone. He had come back not as the man who had run, but as the man who had come through the running and found on the other side of it the person he was capable of being. And Mabel Underwood had looked at that person with the clear, unclouded eyes she had always had, and had said yes, and had meant it with everything she was, and the meaning had held. It held in the schoolhouse that smelled of chalk and good work. It held in the house at the edge of town with the obsidian stone on the windowsill. It held in the Tuesday evenings when the adult students came and worked their way through letters and numbers and the dignity of learning, and in the mornings when Isaiah took their son out to read the prairie like a book, and in the evenings when Clara sat absorbed in whatever volume she had pulled down from the shelf, and in all the 10,000 ordinary moments that are the substance of a life when the life is a good one. Caldwell Creek moved into the 1890s with the slower, settled rhythm of a town that had survived its frontier era and become something more permanent. The school building Mabel had fought for became a point of local pride. Ruth Ann took over the younger classes entirely, and Mabel, older now, moved into a different role, organizing the curriculum, the books, the community education functions that had expanded with the town. She was 40 by the turn of the decade, still teaching, still running her Thursday evening literacy programs, still the most authoritative presence in any room she entered, and now with the additional gravity of a woman who had built something lasting with her hands and her mind. Isaiah at 44 was still the person Carter Webb called when the territory presented a problem that required someone who could read the land. He was still the person the ranchers hired when they needed to know the watershed in a dry summer or the best passage through the hills. He had become, in the way of people who do what they are good at for long enough, simply a fixture of that landscape, a man so thoroughly native to the land that it was difficult to imagine the land without him. Thomas William, at 12, was everything Isaiah had been at that age and everything Thomas the elder had been, the best combination of both, curious and patient and already capable of tracking a deer across solid ground. He would be a man of the land when he was grown. That was certain. Clara, at 10, would be a woman of books. That was equally certain. And Mabel, watching her daughter read by the lamplight with the same posture she herself had had at that age, thought that there were worse legacies to leave a person than a love of learning and the habits of a clear mind. In the spring of 1892, their youngest was born, a second son, born in April, whom they named James after no one in particular because they both liked the name, and it needed no additional significance. The name itself was enough. James arrived with a surprising calm that seemed unlikely to persist, but which his first month suggested might actually be his nature, a child who watched the world around him with a settled curiosity rather than protest. Thomas William received his new brother with a proprietary enthusiasm that required some management. Clara received him with the evaluative scrutiny of an older sibling who has already been through this once and knows what it means for the household economy. The evening James was 1 month old. Isaiah and Mabel sat on the porch again in the late April light with the baby sleeping inside, and the two older children doing their respective things. Thomas William somewhere with a stick and a purpose. Clara with a book, and the cottonwood trees were coming into their leaves with that particular yellow-green color they have in the earliest spring. And the whole world seemed new in the specific way. It always seemed new in April regardless of how many Aprils had come before. Isaiah said, "Do you remember the first evening on the creek path?" "Of course," she said. "You were so careful," he said. "So precisely careful, not unkind. Just you were giving me exactly as much as I had earned and not one thing more." "That is accurate," she said. "I was terrified," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You did not show it." "I showed it to myself," he said. "I was absolutely certain you were going to send me away." "I thought about it," she admitted. "What stopped you?" She considered this honestly, the way she considered everything. "I think I knew that I still wanted to know what it was going to be," she said. "Whatever it was going to be. even if it turned out to be nothing more than the confirmation that we had been better before and could not go back to it. I wanted to know the shape of the thing rather than always wondering. "And what shape is it?" he asked. She looked out at the greening prairie and at the cottonwoods and at the road that ran through the middle of Caldwell Creek and at the schoolhouse she could see from their porch, and she felt the house behind her with the children in it and the man beside her, and all the accumulated weight and warmth of a life that had been built honestly and carefully, and with full knowledge of the work it required. "It is exactly the right shape," she said. He took her hand and they sat on the porch in the April evening, with the sun going down behind the flat horizon, and the first stars appearing in the deepening blue above. And the coyotes started up in the distance as they always did at this hour, and the land lay vast and ancient and full around them. And Isaiah Fairchild and Mabel Underwood Fairchild held on to each other in the easy, certain way of people who have earned the right to hold on. And the night came slowly in over the prairie. And the lights of Caldwell Creek came on one by one, and it was good, and it was whole, and it was home.